Welcome to the Simpleton Podcast. Today, Clark is out. He is at training with our new crew of volunteers in Kansas City, so that's very exciting. And I have my friend Mary joining me to co-host today. So we're here in Hyattsville, Maryland. So Mary and I have known each other and been friends for many years. She is a teacher at my kids' school. And also did PhD work on medieval historians, which you will soon learn why that is relevant. So we want to talk about history as a discipline today. And there's a funny thing that Father Adam has said to us, and that is that hagiography is the history of making sacred cows. And revisionist history is the killing of these sacred cows. And Clark and I have talked about this. If you got history in the 80s and 90s, like every history class, every history book was just like a takedown of like the institution or whatever, like understanding of history we had. And so everything was just like disproving this sort of narrative that had been dominant for many years. And we've noticed that there's kind of this backlash or reaction to this now. We have Clark and I have both encountered Catholics trying to show how the church is not as evil as we were taught, or kind of trying to prove that the church is valid through history. And in the 90s, I felt like there was something in the air where it's you're not supposed to defend the church. And it's even if you were a Catholic, you were supposed to think that the church was kind of evil. And a common question was you think Christianity is good or the Catholicism is good. Well, what about the Crusades? What about the Inquisition? Mm-hmm. And with the education I had, it was kind of I don't know. But now I'm kind of running into these and I think you have said you've had the same experience where it's let me show you why the Catholic Church was actually a good player in the Spanish Inquisition. And maybe the church is actually more sympathetic than some of us learn in history class, but it's wrong or incomplete to say the church was a good player in the Spanish Inquisition, so so that's sort of the setup of why we want to talk about this. And Mary and I like to talk about a lot of these kind of things, and question she said made me think about we have kind of theologians and philosophers and maybe church people trying to write these better curriculums to teach our children, and are they the right people to do that is a question that I have been thinking about. And so in this episode we kind of want to talk about how did we end up in this situation, what is the difference between the disciplines philosophy, theology, history, and does it matter? How, as Catholics, should we read and understand history, and then the danger of thinking about history or writing history, presenting history as propaganda or a defense of our faith. So here we go. Can you give us kind of an overview of how you think we're kind of got in this?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me. This is something I've been thinking about for many years, so you're giving me a space to talk about it. So I'll start with your first point, the revisionist history of the 80s and 90s, and the takedown, right, of those sacred cows. Mm-hmm. So we'll go back about 120 years to the mid 19th century. And this is where you see the rise of empirical history that needs to be verified by fact, which is often going to the documents, things that we sort of take for granted, like, of course you should be looking at the original sources. But this is what historians at this period are claiming, like history needs to be verified by fact. Cause and effect in history has to be able to be verified with some type of fact, original source, something that's sort of quantifiable. At the same time that you have this development in history, which is part of like a larger intellectual movement, you also see the professionalization of historians. So it's not just sort of like the lord of the manor writing the history of, his people, or a bishop, this is writing the history of his diocese. You have basically professors writing history, and there's the product is something that could be critiqued by fellow historians, fellow professionals. So that is something that's going on in the late 20th century. You also you're seeing the end of confessional history, where historians, and this goes back, to the Protestant Reformation, where you have historians trying to prove that their confession, meaning Calvinist, Protestant in general, Lutheran, or Catholic, that their doctrine is correct by looking at history, by looking at the workings of history, which assumes that you can see the workings of God in history. But there's this proof, almost history is apologetics. So we see the real end of this and the rise of progressive history, where progress, right? You're just looking this idea that history is a story of progress. It might be progress in material culture, or progress in freedom, right? There's more. We are more free at this moment in time, late 19th century, early 20th century, than we were, especially when we think about all those medieval peasants. We know so much more. We're way more free than those people. We've progressed really far. You see the rise of Marxist history, which is looking at history as a story of, conflict between the classes. Nationalist history, where it's the story of German nationalism, Whig history in England, or the rejection of Whig history in England, which has to do with freedom. But these are national stories. So this is late 19th century. We see a lot of nationalist history. And then, so you just have this way of writing history, which, it has to do with politics. It has to do with questions of freedom, it's the story of man, but you'll notice it's the story of man that's been that religion is often removed from his story. It centers, like later on, we see class conflict come back. You have Marxist class conflict, but then you have class conflict in the mid 20th century. You have a movement away from intellectual history, a history of ideas, towards a social history, where you might be more interested in people who didn't necessarily write about ideas or leave big records. It's like the everyman history. You see this. I'm specifically talking about American history, or in the back of my mind, I have the way people were writing about American history. I mean, at all this time, you have, obviously there's people writing about medieval history and ancient history. I mean, it's not, but these trends, you kind of see these trends in all sorts of history. People wanting to write the story of medieval Europe, and they're like, don't talk about the church. Or if they do talk about the church, it's kind of this evil entity that the people needed to, rise up above. But we see historians talking about people, like the nameless, faceless people, kind of for the first time in the mid 20th century, and we start to see narratives of oppression and resistance to that oppression, and some of these histories might be more or less concerned with religion. it's kind of hard not to talk about the church if you're looking at medieval Europe, but some people manage to really push them away. But religion or God basically has no more explanatory power in these historical narratives that come after the professionalization. I will say that you do have a few Catholic intellectuals, like a very few Catholic intellectuals talking about history in the 20th century. Christopher Dawson is probably the most well-known.
Is he Harvard?
He was at Harvard.
Yeah.
He was at Harvard for like a couple of years, more towards the end of his life.
Okay.
And he died, I think some of his last debates were against Foucault, who's like the power guy, power and oppression. And I'm like, oh, I wish he'd been able to talk about some other things.
Yeah.
But Hilaire Belloc also wrote some things about history. They were both cultural history. Dawson was really known, and his legacy is sort of a cultural history that that the culture of religion is what formed Europe.
Yeah.
And that's his legacy as a historian. But he's, in some ways, he's kind of all we got.
Yeah.
You know, in terms, and when you think of some of the intellectuals of the Catholic intellectuals of the 20th century, like it's interesting. It's not that there weren't Catholic historians. It's just that they weren't Catholic intellectuals, which is, they were historians who happened to be Catholic, which is, I think we'll sort of talk a little bit about that. Let's see. I think is that pretty much an overview?
I think you said like something you said when I asked about like history class in the 90s. Something you said to me is like this. That's like when we see like kind of the historians of the 60s like making it in the textbooks.
Absolutely. So one thing that we have to think about is like the work of the historians, like it takes a while to filter down into the texts, into the kids' textbooks. Yeah. You know, sometimes you'll have, and of course I can't think of anyone off the top of my head right now, but you'll have really important historians writing a textbook, but it's usually when they've established themselves, right? Or they're overseeing a textbook writing project. So they've made a name for themselves, which means that they have studied for, 15 years at least. You know, they might have written sort of a seminal monograph on some question of American history or medieval history or European history. Yeah. And so by the time those textbooks make it into the classroom, the work is at least several decades old. Yeah. And when we think about like some of the revisionist or takedown history, like some of it might have been like an appropriate correction, right? Like if we had these kind of histories written by bishops. Right. I think that some of them are probably appropriate, and some of them, in all the different sort of historical movements that I was talking about, you have historians who are writing. Don't let any historian ever tell you that they can write history, like unbiased history. Yeah. It's just impossible. Yeah. Right? So someone who might be really concerned with questions, like who came of age during the civil rights movement, might be really concerned about questions of race in America and might want to revise. And I'm trying to like revise how we think about the history of colonial America. So I can't. There's a Black poet from the 1790s that I'm ashamed I can't think of her right now, but she was a slave and was classically educated and wrote poetry. And is she someone that anyone knew anything about, prior to the mid 20th century? No, because you were studying sort of like great men and, the legacy of the Declaration of Independence and how the Declaration of Independence paved the way for, a growing freedom of, man in America. And so a revisionist history might look at someone, Phyllis Wheatley, might look at her, might look at what Frederick Douglass had to say about liberty, what Langston Hughes had to say about, so a revisionist history might say that these Black men and women, and we could go on into the 20th century, what did they have to say about freedom in America? And so that would be revisionist because you're changing the narrative, the narrative that might have been accepted for 100 years. But that can also just be really good history. Yeah. Or you can have a revisionist history that only sees the world in terms of like victim and oppressor. Yeah. Oppressed and oppressed. So that kind of revisionist history, which tends to distort or create just as much distortion as what they say they're trying to correct.
Yeah. I think like the example of the Inquisition, there's a lot painting, so I don't even know how to talk about this, but right. It's like the Catholic Church is this evil kind of tool. It's evil, persecuting, torture, killing, ruthless. All these pictures, and then if you read something, some of the things I kind of have in mind, maybe written in the last 10 or 15 years. That is trying to do a history for Catholics or something. Sure. It's like, no, the Catholic Church was actually good in the Inquisition because, people were after the Jews and the Catholic Church actually moderated, this persecution.
So this is actually a really good example of that what I was talking about earlier about how does this make it. How does professional history writing make it into more of the layman's consciousness? Because there actually is the work of a historian, Louis Hankey, in the mid 20th century, who reevaluated the Black legend. The Black legend is that the Spanish were evil. The Catholic Church was evil, this instrument of oppression. And this comes out of confessional history, right? These are Protestants, so the Dutch, the English, probably Germans are writing about the Spanish Empire because in the early modern period, they still have an empire, right? Yeah. I mean, we tend to think of Spain as kind of separate from Europe because it was insulated being a part of a peninsula. But anyway, so the evil Spanish who basically didn't have a Protestant Reformation, they have this empire, they're evil, and the Inquisition is the perfect example of how they're evil. Yeah. And you should all be Protestant, right? And so you have this Black legend that grows up, and then you have Louis Hankey, this historian of the 20th century, who is like, wait a second, let's reconsider, let's go to the sources. He brings to light the work of Bartolomeo de las Casas, who was a Spanish, I guess he was a conquistador, but he was definitely a layman going over, trying to make his fortune in the New World, was involved in the oppression of the natives and, the oppression and the destruction, the death of the natives in slavery, and then had this incredible change of heart where he basically were like, wait, these are men. And he goes back to Spain and advocates for their humanity. And, so there's actually all sorts of things that we can trace back to his work. And he becomes a Dominican friar, which sometimes is downplayed depending on if you're looking at
the audience you're trying to
appeal to. If you are talking about the rise of human rights and international law, there's another Spaniard who's involved in this too. In tracing the rise of human rights, which is a story of an idea. Yeah. but they are like, oh yeah, he became a Dominican friar, but we'll maybe give one sentence to that, you know? But anyway, so Louis Hankey like recovers this. I don't think he wrote a lot on the Spanish Inquisition. But there are other historians working on the Spanish Inquisition that discovered like, oh, like this Inquisition couldn't actually do some of these things, or looking at the limits put on the Inquisition, they could only torture people once. Yeah. And we're like, and whereas the lay, you know, like the secular government, like didn't put limitations on itself. And we're like, wait a second, they were actually putting limits on themselves, thinking about you had the right to know who was accusing you. Yeah. In the Inquisition, that wasn't something in the secular courts. You didn't have to know who accused you of a crime. But so there was this quote revision of, you know, the Spanish in the New World, the Inquisition, that is it positive? It just gave more nuance and more context to what was going on amongst all these things, and tried to answer or tried to give a story about them that wasn't dealing with this confessional. Like they have to be evil because they're Catholic. Like this is our assumption. And so all, you know, but then all of these stories, which sort of mitigate, maybe are more sympathetic, give more context for the actions, they make its way into the layman, you know, stories, textbooks for children. Catholics read them, and, you know, the response is, hey, we're not as bad, and which is actually really human. If you had to listen to people tell you in America, which is a Protestant nation, just is, you know, it was never Catholic, unlike so many parts of Europe. You know, there's so much anti-Catholicism in America. There's so much anti-Catholicism in the history of America. So if you, as a Catholic, had to like bear this, and maybe your family was immigrants, and, you know, you were like, wait, we're not that bad. That's a real human response. Yeah. But is that what, I mean, Louis Hankey wasn't trying to, you know, exonerate the Catholic Church. He was just trying to give a more full, whole picture of the history. Yeah. Right. I feel like these texts will read like trying to exonerate the church that still had standards of torture. Right. Yeah. So that's when like there's, I mean, we can't lose sight of that just because, you know, and we don't want to do what the Black legend was created to, like, almost ahistorically, or, I mean, there was actual real material that they built on, but we don't want to sort of just like be the same side or the the flip side of the same coin. Yeah. Right. That it's like, it's either a takedown of Catholics or an exoneration of Catholics by history. Yeah. Like using the history to do one of these things. Yeah. Let's talk about, so history as a discipline, and it's like maybe something you have said is like it's hard to be taken seriously as like an academic in the field of history if you're like seriously Catholic. And in my experience, the people kind of trying to do the corrective work have been more trained in like other disciplines like philosophy or theology. And so I guess like why would a philosopher or theologian be concerned about history, how we present it? Like, are they able to speak about history? And sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, it is hard, to like, there are historical reasons why Catholics who have been practicing historians have tried to distance themselves from their Catholicism. And it's the anti-Catholic nature. Like a lot of universities were founded as Protestant divinity schools, and maybe became more secular, but, you know, like, how are you going to be taken seriously at little provincial Notre Dame University in 1940, because we forget that Notre Dame was kind of a provincial,
Okay.
Like you couldn't, it was really hard to be a Catholic at Harvard, so you were going to go to your tiny little school. And if you're the academics there, you could be provincial or parochial. You know, that's like, it is a pejorative term sometimes.
Yeah.
Or you could try and say, no, I'm not going to let my Catholicism affect my views on what I'm studying. And, so you have Catholic historians trying to make it and in mainstream academia. And I would just like to say I'm painting with like a rather broad brush here. So I think there's all sorts of people that we could point to and be like, what about this person? What about this person? They really tried. They did this. And all of that is true. But I'm just talking about like, to go back to the beginning, like, why do we have all of these Catholic intellectuals in theology and philosophy that we can point to in the 20th century? But then we have Dawson. And we don't necessarily put the Catholic historians that are out there, some of whom, I've had, like, I'm thinking of a couple where I've had like really beautiful conversations about faith with, we don't like put them on that list, So there's like historical reasons why Catholic historians distance themselves from like a Catholic intellectual tradition. And they sort of wrote within these new narratives that were popping up in the 20th century. So progressive, an examination of liberty in America or freedom in America, nationalists, like can Catholics be American? I mean, this was like a very real question that, historians sort of examine, but can Catholics be American? I mean, that was a question that people were asking for real.
That's wild.
And so a lot of Catholics were like, we can be. Like, I'll downplay. My religion is, individual.
Yeah.
It's not of public concern.
Yeah.
So I think, they're writing stories of, histories within these different narratives, these narratives that are a-religious, sometimes anti-religious, and you have philosophers and theologians looking at this now and saying, these narratives are wrong.
Yeah.
Because what is a philosopher and the theologian supposed to do? So, with apologies to all of my philosopher and theologian friends, a philosopher looks at what reality is, and a theologian tells us about who God is. And obviously there's a million things to look at and examine for that. But if I had to sum it up in 2 sentences, and so a philosopher would look at like a progressive narrative, or a theologian might look at a progressive or Marxist narrative and say, this is not reality. This narrative that is the frame of the history that was written does not describe what a Catholic believes reality or knows reality to be. And so this history is inadequate for us as Catholics.
Yes. I think I want to backtrack a little bit.
Sure.
You talked about like the professionalization of history and like looking for like using empirical evidence. And I think like it's kind of a two-edged sword, right? And like for the church, like it sort of, there's like a positive thing of like having faith and reason being able to, be used together, and having like Catholics are making historical claims and being able to say like, hey, this is not just a fairy tale or whatever, but like here's some historical evidence. That's like a positive thing.
Yes.
But the other side of that is like, if you're focusing on empirical data or evidence, it kind of takes God out of the picture, right?
Because it's verifiable fact, empirical fact, and the Bible is revealed truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that revelation is really important. That idea of revelation is really important. And we can either, I mean, I think that some historians, and I'm not just talking about Catholic historians here, I just mean like historians were like, well, it's revealed truth. It can't be proven empirically. So we're going to throw it out to write history. Yeah. Or you can, think of like all truth is the purview of the church. And so how can we think about them complementary? Yeah. These forms of knowledge as complementary forms of knowledge. Right. Complementary meaning like they complete one another, but they don't necessarily take the place of the other. Yes.
So I guess I think it's like interesting because you have like all these like Catholics saying like, oh, and maybe Christians too, like in a wider, like, oh, we're not using like our religion as an interpretive key, but then it's replaced with all these other interpretive keys.
Yes, exactly.
And so it's like, why are those valid? And this invalid?
Well, I actually don't think they are invalid for us to use. Okay. And some of them are like,
what's not invalid?
I don't think the other interpretive keys are invalid as tools, let's say. Yeah. Like there's nothing wrong with like examining how a group of people interpreted liberty in America, like in the 19th century or something like that. Or how a group of, let's take it out of America for a second, how a group of peasants understood Orthodox Catholicism in 13th century France. Yeah. Shout out to Saint Dominic, right? His feast day yesterday. So these are not, and looking at that as like, sorry, I'm thinking of like actually a specific book that examined like how the environment and the living situation of these peasants like might have led to heresy. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. And so there is not, so like looking at economics, like how economics might have or material living might have formed or shaped the lives of these people that led to, a movement away from orthodoxy. Yeah.
I was trying to say, the opposite, but it's the same. It's the same. Like, I guess like why, it would be dishonest for academia to, academics in history to say this is not a valid interpretive key. Right. But now we're going to use all these other ones that are just like
actually is the paradox of a lot of these is like a lot of these late 19th, 20th century historians were like, oh, everything's based on empirical evidence now. Yeah. We're not interpreting it through, religion. And they just were like, it wasn't any less interpretive, interpreted through a lens. Yeah. It just wasn't this lens. Yeah. And that they wouldn't, like anyone who tried to write, who tried to bring God into the equation, at a certain point, he comes back as a concern, right? Of history writers, of historians. Yeah, there's always an interpretive lens.
Yeah. And the point you were making about there is value in like looking at historical events through these other interpretive lenses, I think is interesting because right now, like in sort of our political climate that we're in, it feels like everything is so fraught that I feel like there is a fear of like using the wrong, right. It's like, so, the idea that we can like gain something from that and like that it's not just a how not to.
Right. Well, and this is where I think professional historians or people reading history, more or less serious history. I mean, there's nothing wrong with taking just something off, like popular history off the shelf. Yeah. But thinking through this idea of like, what's the interpretive lens? You know, did this historian writing this book, you know, were they aiming to, you know, elevate the people? Like, were they telling a story of like class conflict, right? Or like the conflict between like people and interests, like special interests or something like that. You know, you can read that and realize that, okay, these sources, they were reading these sources, they were trying to tell this story. You can bring some judgment to that. Is there something valid? Is there something valid about, you know, studying the poor and, you know, the interactions of the poor and big business? But at the end, like, that interpretive lens should be seen, if we can, as a tool and not the reality, which gets back to like what the philosophers and the theologians are rightly critiquing. Is the historian using the lens as like, this is reality, or is it just like, you know, one way of viewing events that, you know, and if we use a lot of different ways of viewing the same events, maybe we'll come as close as we possibly can to understanding something that was.
So can we, I guess, so understanding history, like your interpretive lens as like reality, like maybe as kind of like a hack way to do history, and like we see a lot of like progressive history, right, that makes that mistake, but like we don't want to make the same mistake in reaction. So could you talk about maybe like like a more full version of understanding history?
Sure. Well, and this phrase that I'm going to use, I really love, and it is from a book called The Past is Pilgrimage by two Catholic historians, Christopher Shannon and Christopher Bloom. One is at Christendom and the other one is at the Augustine Institute. And they use this phrase master narrative. But it's really how they use the phrase that I really like. And they say that that historians have to have a master narrative to write history. And the proper master narrative for a Catholic is the one that's our reality, right? God created the world. There was the fall, the incarnation, and the birth of the church. I mean, the creation of the world and incarnation are kind of the two biggest ones there. But the creation, we're living in the period of the church, and we are marching towards the end. Right? There is going to be an end to the world. And that is all of us as man are going to experience both the second coming, like as the world, but we are all going to experience like a personal judgment. And that is the master narrative that Catholics should bring to their understanding of history.
Is this different from like the interpretive lens or related to?
So they say, and I agree, that the master narrative is not the end of history, meaning, and what I think that means as like readers of history, and if you are, we're all historians, right? We all tell our children about like their family of origin, maybe something about their community or their parish, or like in America, we all, the most of us have some type of immigrant story. So we're all historians. We're always telling our children. We're always telling our children history. So that master narrative is, I think, is our frame, but it's not the end. It's not the end of history. And I think that's because we don't actually, I'm getting it's getting complicated because there's like certain philosophical terms like the telos of history. Like progressives believe the telos of history is like to make us more free, right? And like our telos as man is to be united with God in heaven. So that's our end, but we can't use that as like an interpretation of history because we don't know when the second coming is. Yeah. Right. We are not responsible for the judgment, for the eternal judgment of human beings. Right. But within this master narrative, the incarnation does put certain responsibilities on us towards our fellow man. And I think that's where this master narrative is a frame for how we do history, how we talk about history. So it's a frame and not... Yeah. It's a frame for how we understand human action. Yeah. Not how we interpret human action. I feel like that's not clear. We know that the telos of history is the second coming of Christ as Catholics, right? This has been revealed to us.
History as like the world and human events. Right. That
unfold. Not the study of history. Yes. Thank you for that clarity. Like the telos of the unfolding of human events is eventually for the second coming. Yeah. We as historians, as writers of history, as tellers of history, if you're a teacher, but even just if you're a parent or someone who talks to someone else about history, right? That we don't know when the second coming is. This is not something that we can like look back on human action and other than know that we all will be judged. We can't know how the events unfold in the story of the end of the world because the end of the world hasn't happened. Yeah. But what we can know, or what we're obliged to do, is to see and understand human beings in light of the incarnation. Yeah, so the incarnation like changes how we view history, and like having a relationship with God and with like other men as Christians changes our approach to history. Yes. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, sure. And this is something that like I have been thinking about for a long time as someone who was training to be a professional historian and who had to grapple with like, you know, I was maybe going to have a career in academia, but I was also I have a Catholic worldview. How do I understand the people that I study, right? How do I talk about, so both as like a professional, you know, I can't be like, I'm writing a Catholic history of, you know, because then you're laughed out of a job. And then I left academia. But I think there's a real question there. Like you know, you look at periods of history where, you know, we're not going to go back to writing history as apologetics, like history as a defense of the church, because I just don't think that's a predetermined end, right? That you're trying to, and then what happens when you encounter the Inquisition? Like, what do you do with that? And so what I was left with is the human being that I was encountering in history, like reading their own words or reading what people said about them, reading like their own thoughts on themselves or their relationship with God. I mean, I was a medieval historian, so you know, they talked about God all the time. And what I realized was this person's end was heaven, hopefully. Just like my end is hopefully heaven. So what is that? We're all part of the same communion of saints. So I was encountering a human that had the same end as me, which was, you know, hopefully unification with charity, God and heaven. And so they're on that plane, we're equal, right? We're part of the same community because my relationship with God and this person's, you know, be he a Genoese archbishop or, like
Southern
an actual
slave
saint
owner
or Southern slave owner
Yeah.
slave owner or, a conquistador or just, a priest who was trying to take care of his flock in medieval England or late, early modern. And then all of a sudden the king is like, but we're not doing this anymore. And you're like, wait a second.
Yeah.
Like we are all going to be judged by the same God.
Yeah.
And so on that plane, like the master narrative is like within that is a narrative of salvation.
Yeah.
But I can't judge them like God judges them.
Yeah.
So I just have to see them as my brother.
Yeah.
Or my sister as my neighbor.
Yeah.
Right. And so what is my responsibility as a historian is to know, and knowledge hopefully breeds love, is to know this person as best as I possibly can.
Yeah.
And so that means like knowing all of the historical context that you possibly can about their time period. How did they get into the situation? Why did they, as best as we can, what were the decisions they made? Why do we think they made them? And that work, brings me closer to this person. And there's no, like a progressive history, might have me say, well, I'm better off because I don't, and it might be like, thank God I don't have to deal with the question of slavery, or something like that. But there's no idea that somehow I've moved away from their condition. My material condition is different. My historical context is different. But, in light of eternity, we're the same. We are on the same exact plane.
Yeah. Yeah. I like this because, it seems like a more complete, fuller view of history rather than like, was Thomas Jefferson, actually racist or whatever, and it's like you focus.
Right.
There's like a micro focus on one attribute that ignores all these like incredible and also some kind of weird things that he did, he was like a strange, quirky person.
Right.
Who also, had a lot of contributions and also some like negative things about his character, like all of us. And I think it's like some of the history that we are reacting to now, maybe conservatives, maybe more generally, are like everything is being like revisited through like the lens of like, was this person a racist or not? Well, we can discard everything. And, like as Catholics, we think, all of us are sinners, right? But all of us are also more than like the sum of our sins.
Right. And that's where like we're more than the sum of our sins, and we're called, for all these people, in a sense, their judgment has already happened, right? Yeah. But we can still pray for them. Yeah. And how do we get to the point where Thomas Jefferson isn't just, like a portrait on the wall. Yeah. And it is through that, what I would say is like historical context, like all those little details that made him who he was, knowing them, so he becomes as real as possible for us. And that, so then we're called to pray for Thomas Jefferson. And I was like talking to a friend about like Calvin and Zwingli, and I was like, yeah, how can we get to a point where we would pray for like, for some reason, Martin Luther, maybe it's just because I know more about him, I've like thought about that before, but I'm like, Zwingli, I'm like, when was the last time someone prayed for Zwingli's soul? Especially considering that as a Protestant, like purgatory was right out,
Right.
So, and I'm like, how would we get to a point?
We need to help all our Protestant
how do we get to a point where we want to pray for his soul? And it's that knowledge, that's where like historical tools and historical judgment comes in, because we don't want to pray for like the Zwingli of my making. I want to pray, I want to know Zwingli as much as I possibly can. So I have to develop historical judgment to do my best job figuring, like, to get as close as I possibly can to the real person.
Yeah.
All the while acknowledging that, like, the past is in the past. Like, I can't bring him forward.
Yeah. Yeah. So this ties into an idea of like, well, like, what do we owe, like, the person we're studying in history? And you said, like, we owe this person justice. Mm-hmm. And what does that mean?
So I think, like, if we are historians or teaching history or just talking about history, this question of what do we owe the subject, mm-hmm. right? Because it's a human being that we're studying, even if we're more interested in ideas and things mm-hmm. like that, there's still the human beings have to have the ideas. Mm-hmm. So what do we owe the subject of our study? And I think this also ties into the question of, like, why history, what is the purpose of history in the first place? Mm-hmm. Or what is the role of history within a Catholic education? And we talk a lot, there's a lot of talk about the purpose of education. Like, it's not just job training, mm-hmm. right? We want to grow as people, and as for Catholics, that means to grow in virtue, mm-hmm. to develop the virtues. Mm-hmm. So, of course, justice mm-hmm. is a virtue, mm-hmm. Is one of the cardinal virtues. And so what does justice mean? Justice means giving the person their due. Mm-hmm. And I think there is this judgment often, like, giving the person their due, can lead to judgment. Mm-hmm. And when we say judgment, we often think of, like, God as the judge, or like a judge in a mm-hmm. courthouse, like we're condemning you. Mm-hmm. But I think judgment for talking about history is, like, sifting through, like, what is useful. So history is useful for growing the virtue of judgment in us as mm-hmm. we judge between like the material in front of us that we're using to tell a story. And then also, like, to have an understanding and a judgment of the person and their actions. But giving the person their due is the first thing we have to do, is marshal all the evidence, right? This would be in a courtroom. You marshal all the evidence to give the fullest picture mm-hmm. Of the person. And then to be able to, we have to understand that person mm-hmm. In front of us, and not just say, like, he owned slaves, he's racist and horrible, and mm-hmm. now we're condemning you. Mm-hmm. I mean, owning slaves was horrible. Yeah. I'm not trying to say that that's not true, but to get the fullest picture and the historical mm-hmm. context, that's our job mm-hmm. as historians, mm-hmm. is to give the fullest picture, the fullest of understanding of possible as the person, because they're owed it. Yeah. Because they're also a child of God. Yeah. They are owed that effort on our behalf of understanding, because they're a child of God just like us. Yeah.
I don't know why this just reminded me of like the Father Brown mysteries, where he I forget, where it's like Father Brown, like, figures out all these mysteries because, like, he is the killer, Right. Not that he's actually, like, right. killing people, but, like, he enters into the mind of the killers and their motivations and what was going on, mm-hmm. and mm-hmm. And their fallenness and all that stuff that he also, as a human person. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it's random.
Yeah, no. I think, well, it's an interesting thing, like, because we often talk about using literature, mm-hmm. To put ourselves in someone else's shoes, mm-hmm. or to explore, to develop an understanding of, like, good and evil. Mm-hmm. Like, literature can often do that, because literature should be a window into the world as it is, mm-hmm. right? And history is the world as it was, right? It's the study of the world. Yeah. But so, what is the, when you're studying history, you can't change things just because you're angry at the action of someone else. And so I think that's where, like, justice comes in is like, we have to accept that people made choices and try and understand those choices, not to explain them away or to say they're, the choices didn't matter, but, we have to be able to put ourselves, we have to try as best as we can to understand why things were the way they were. Even if it's like an affront to our sensibilities of what is good and true.
I think of trying to understand the way that world works, trying to understand the way people act, and it's like, even if, I think the more you are able to like fill in, like it's like kind of should give a richness to your like worldview and your faith and like concepts of mercy and sin and forgiveness. And I think approaching this from like, we are all people in the same boat, in the same like playing out of history and this, place and time that God has put us in, like it like lends to that. But I think right now, I think there's like a temptation to say, rather than what I just said, like, well, who were the good actors and who were the bad actors in history, and like,
right. And
I
think this is where I do think, like, as Catholics who are writing history or reading history, like, we do have a sense of the good, right? We do. So it's not that we can't judge actions of the past, right? I think especially after you've come to a full understanding, you can try and see some of those actions in light of eternity. But what happens is, do we decide that some people are part of the narrative and some people aren't? Or some people outside of the community, and some people aren't. And I think that hopefully everyone's response is like, of course, everyone has a hope of salvation. But are we crafting a story? Are we crafting a narrative where we are seeing people as our brother, or are we kind of using a lens where we craft a narrative where we look askance at, like the way a progressive narrative would be like, thank God we've shuffled off those people,
the shackles of
right, like
are we the shackle or whatever,
and so what is our narrative, and does our use of judgment and also prudence, because I think prudence is another virtue that can be developed, like deciding what's important is another virtue that is part of being a historian. Is this leading to a fuller understanding of God's community, or like a who's in, who's out kind of thing?
There's going to be a part 2. We wanted to talk about this article titled Lenin Sink, and also this discuss the work and life of Carlos Eyre, right? Who is both a historian and like he has like a what's it called? A biography.
Memoir. Because he grew up in Cuba, right, and was a boy when the communists took over.
And a thing that really has like stood out to me from this Lenin Think article that I keep thinking about and seeing over and over is like that Lenin thought the world, like everything, was just like a zero-sum game. Like either I am winning and you are losing, or you are winning and I am losing. And that this type of thinking has like infected all of us. And like, even though in like the US we generally condemn like communism, this actually well, okay, yes. we have historically condemned communism. Despite that, this type of thinking like really has like infected us. And so seeing the world like through this lens, you know, well, is it class struggle? Is it feminist? Like, is it struggle between the sexes, or, you know, whatever struggle you see it in? So I think the interesting thing is like, do we do the same thing is it like, you know, like the right, like sort of Catholic history and everybody that's against us?
Well, yeah. Is it like a struggle of Catholics against everyone else?
Yes. And I think like we can, there's like a temptation there, right, that we can fall into, and gives us the same, you know, problem that we were just talking about.
Right.
But from the other.
And I think, you know, I mean, like if we are part of a cosmic struggle of like good versus evil, you know, I mean, this is where, you know, that master narrative of like, there was a fall, like the incarnation was for salvation, and we're moving towards salvation, right? Hopefully we're all moving towards salvation. But that happened through a person. Our salvation happened through the person of Jesus Christ. Didn't happen through an idea. Didn't happen through a cultural movement or a class movement. And so it's not that like Catholics have always struggled. I mean, Christ said, you know, like, you know, what's the line? You know, if people hate you, you're one of that's a horrible summary of the quote in the Bible, but you know, like you're not of like this world. You will be hated and persecuted in my name. So I don't want to say that that's not a reality. But I think that the corrective for like, you know, we could just start to see enemies everywhere. The corrective is not to fall into a trap of understanding history as the Catholic Church against everyone else, or like, and I think, or, you know, doing some weird adaptation of a progressive a history, or a history of, you know, freedom. It's to focus on the human person. Because we were saved through a human person. Like, the church is incarnational. People matter. Right? We don't work our salvation out through anything else but people. And that's the crux, I think, of being a Catholic historian. We're trying to understand history as in a Catholic way.
And it's, so I think the other phrase, like being on the right side of history, is like a thing that people are very concerned about right now. And I think it's like, if you're doing history, trying to show that the Catholic Church is on the right side of history, you're going to be disappointed. And if your faith like hinges on that, you know, you're in danger. So let's do Lenin. Let's do Lenin and Stalin.
And
next week or next time, hopefully. All right. Well,
Great.
Thank you, Mary.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Please like, subscribe, recommend our podcast, and thank you for joining us. God bless you.